Hi everyone, Tiffany here from Tiffany Gordon Cosplay, and on this episode of Tips video, we're going to be going over how I made my ruler's sword and sheath from Fate. I first started off by getting reference images of ruler's sword and sheath. Next, I made a 2-scale template in Adobe Illustrator, and the template is available on my website. See the link below. I then imported my Adobe Illustrator lines into a 3D modeling program called Rhino 6 and made my 3D model of the sword and the sheath. Now, let's talk about how I made the sword. I segmented my sword CAD so that way it could print on my Prusa i3 Mark 2.5 3D printer, and I printed it in ABS filament. In total, the sword was split up into 11 segments. I then cut carbon fiber tubes and inserted them into the 3D printed pieces and used epoxy to glue them together. Once all the epoxy was dried, I then used a file and sandpaper to get rid of all of the seam segments. Then I used a wet paper towel to wipe down the entire piece. To get rid of the stair-step look on the 3D printed parts, I covered the entire sword in flexible spackling and let dry. Once it was dry, then I sanded the entire sword, and again, wiped it down with a wet paper towel. Next, I covered the entire sword in a sandable spray paint and let dry. Once it was dry, I sanded. Then I did a base coat of black airbrush paint on the entire sword, and then airbrush painted it silver. Next, I masked off the silver painted areas with masking tape, and then airbrush painted it a blue iridescent color. Once all of the paint was dry, I then removed the masking tape and added details by hand with black acrylic paint. Once this was done, I sealed the whole entire sword with a satin clear enamel spray paint. Now, let's talk about how I made the sheath. Again, I had to split the CAD of my sheath so that it would fit on my 3D printer and printed all of the segments in ABS filament. As with all 3D printing, I had to remove the support structure. I then had to gather felt, scissors, and a ruler for our next part. I then cut felt into rectangle shapes that would fit the length of the sheath sections, and applied leather weld glue to one side of the felt. I then attached the felt sections to the inside pieces of the 3D printed sheath sections and had extra felt hanging off of both sides so that way I could easily attach it. I repeated this process until all 4 sides of the inside of the sheath sections were covered with felt. The reason for adding felt to the inside of the sheath is so that way the sword does not rub against the 3D printed material and cause paint to chip off, and then trimmed off the excess felt. Next, I applied epoxy to the 3D printed pieces and attached each of the segments together. When all of the pieces were dry, I then applied flexible spackling and let that dry. Then I sanded the sheath. Don't forget to wipe dry with a wet paper towel after you're done. Then I sprayed a coat of sandable spray paint and let dry. For painting, I first started off with a base coat of black airbrush paint, followed by silver. Once all the paint was dry, I then sealed it with a coat of satin clear enamel spray paint. I then made a template and cut out black leather to cover the sheath. To attach the leather to the 3D printed parts of the sheath, I applied leather weld to the entire top half. I then laid the leather on top and smoothed it out with a leather burnishing tool. I then repeated this process until all 4 sides were covered with the leather. And that is how I made my sword and my sheath for my ruler cosplay from Fate. Thanks for watching, guys, and I hope you enjoyed this video. And if so, remember to help support the channel by subscribing. Much love!